Welcome to the Startup Grind.
The name is Russ Hancock. I'm the president of an organization called Joint Venture Silicon Valley. We bring together the region's business leaders and government leaders, and we tackle Silicon Valley's issues. And our premise is that Silicon Valley is a very special place, and the reason it's special is because of people like you. We've somehow managed to build this ecosystem for startups and for people who are innovative and creative. And the question that guides all of our work is, how can we keep that going? How can we keep Silicon Valley at the epicenter of these kinds of activities, innovation, creativity, and so forth? So I thought, if I've understood my assignment today, is to tell you the big picture on Silicon Valley, how we're doing as a region, what our prospects are for staying competitive in that way. And I'll take you through a few slides, and then I'm interested in dialogue on these issues. If you want to pepper me with questions, that's all great. It's perfectly great. Let me start with this obvious question. What is Silicon Valley? The fact is, most people don't know the answer to this question. None of us can ever answer it definitively. And it's especially hard to talk about it to people who are outside of our region, because there's so many myths and misperceptions about it. I'm not going to belabor all of them. In fact, I'll go through this really quickly, but especially when people call us up from overseas and they want to talk about Silicon Valley, we always have to explain this stuff to them. We have to tell them that it's actually not a geographical designation, that there isn't a Silicon Valley government, right? That there's no framework for Silicon Valley thinking or for decision making. We always have to point out that there's actually no silicon in Silicon Valley anymore. That probably left in the 70s or 80s, something like it. In fact, we've changed our portfolio mix many times over the decades, so we have to point that out. But I'll tell you what else is really important. It was not a planned phenomenon. We always have to really work on this point with people, for example, from China, when they call us. And they've decided that they would like to create a Silicon Valley of their own, and they want to put it right here. And to them, it's a simple matter of infrastructure. If it needs to be built, we can build it. And if you need a university, no problem. We'll put it right there. If you need an industrial park surrounding it, we can build it. We can do all of this. And so we always have to explain that it's not just a built environment. And then we have to explain to them that there isn't anybody in Silicon Valley who ever sat in a government office and said, I know, let's create a high-tech industrial park. And let's make sure that there's a world-class university in the middle and that there's these informal and formal linkages to the entrepreneurial startups around it. And let's make sure we're channeling federal investments, and let's make sure we're building up the R&D infrastructure. I mean, nobody did that. The thing about Silicon Valley is that it's just an accident. So I think maybe you understood that already, but I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. Silicon Valley isn't anything anybody planned. It just happened. And so we define it as this incredibly enduring hotbed of what you do, entrepreneurship and innovation. Maybe I'll just skip over this stuff here. It is interesting that Silicon Valley, if it was a state, it would be about the size of Delaware, the state of Delaware. So you have all of this economic activity that's driving the nation's economic engine. More than half of California patents, 9% of California GDP, all of this stuff, and it's happening in a state that's smaller than Delaware. In fact, if we were a state, if Silicon Valley was an American state, we'd probably rank about 17 in terms of our population. So that's what's going on. The other interesting thing about Silicon Valley is that with such a highly educated workforce, I'll just point this out really quickly. 43% of our people have college degrees, and I mean multiple degrees. There's no place in the world that can make that claim except for us. 25% of our workforce is doing what you do. They're in these really high-skilled occupations, and the national average is 12%. So we double the national average. That's interesting. The other interesting thing is that 37% of our population here in Silicon Valley is foreign-born. I think it's an important point to stress because, in a very real sense, Silicon Valley was not built by the people that live here. In that sense, it was not an American phenomenon. It was really it's built by the best and brightest throughout the entire world who came here and wanted to pursue this path to creativity and to prosperity. So that means, maybe I'm telling you what you already know, but that means that immigration issues are of crucial importance to Silicon Valley. Couldn't be more important. And we're always frustrated because we think our leaders in Washington are completely tone deaf on that issue. So anyway, there's some of its interesting characteristics, but I would suggest that our most interesting characteristic as a region is that we have somehow managed to reinvent ourselves umpteen times over the decades and over the generations. And here's a chart that sort of lays it out. You know, it all started with vacuum tube technology, went from there into the transistor, went from there into the integrated circuit and the semiconductor revolution. That led to the computer and large-scale computing, then the personal computer, and then the software revolution, then the internet revolution. The reason I lay all of those out, and by the way, at the same time, we've got the biotechnology revolution happening, personalized medicine. The reason I lay all that out is because there is no body of economic theory that would ever predict this. In fact, economic theory predicts the exact opposite. It predicts that one place, one locality will carve out an advantage in one area, but then the competition will flood in, and advantages always shift. They always shift to another set of players, another locality. And that's not what's been happening with Silicon Valley, and it's a very strange outcome. And we struggle to explain that. Economists actually can't explain that. Especially, I'll point out another obvious observation. All of these generations of technology have very different requirements, different functional requirements, different requisites, different economies of scale. They couldn't be more different. And yet there we are commanding the advantage decade after decade. This chart tells you the same thing. It sort of lays out the generations of technology and innovation that's come out of Silicon Valley. Here I'll show you the same chart. And it has, of course, now those same generations of technology, but you see the names of the companies that are associated with it. So the point I'll make here is that what we have to tell policymakers all the time, what we have to remind them constantly, is that Silicon Valley is actually two things. It's a land of innovation, right, science and technology and research and all of that, but it's also a land of entrepreneurship, and it's both. It's the fact that you have both here that makes Silicon Valley so remarkable. And when I say entrepreneurship, I'm talking about the ability to do what you do, which is to connect ideas to the marketplace and then very quickly scale up for international scale commerce. There's no place in the world that has done this, that has this record of achievement, and is still doing it. There are places that have excellence. There are many pockets of excellence on the innovative side or maybe on a certain sector of business, but there's no place that's doing both, connecting those ideas to the marketplace, making those breakthroughs, and creating companies that become household names. That's what's so unusual about Silicon Valley. There's a third thing unusual about it, is that it's not just the technology and the technical things that's up for grabs, it's the business model itself. And of course, you know that, you do this. But Silicon Valley is a place that has decided that the way we deliver commerce, the way we deliver services is also ripe for disruption. And these are all examples of it. Okay, I want to point out one last thing that I always show our visitors when they come to visit from overseas and they're trying to get a handle on Silicon Valley and how it works. This chart shows you what an amazing place this is, what a brutalizing place this is, and how demanding it is to live here and operate. This is a chart. I just picked two random years, 20 years apart. Could have picked any 2 years. But here we are in 1982, and this is a chart that shows you Silicon Valley's major employers. Could have laid it out any different way, revenue, market share, whatever, but this is actually head count. So this is how many people they employed in Silicon Valley, and we've given you the list of the top 10 employers in 1982. And then here's the same top 10 in 20 years later, 2002. So what's amazing about this list is that the ones I've shaded in pink no longer existed in 2002, okay? I just want to make sure you get this. I'm not saying they fell out of the top 10. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying they were gone, deceased, right? Defunct. And then these ones I've shaded in green, they didn't even exist 20 years earlier. I mean, they weren't even a figment of anybody's imagination, and yet here they are now in the top 10. So again, there's no place in the world that can tell you this. In fact, if you were to do this in some other region, let's say Detroit, that's what your chart would look like, right? And it's pretty amazing to think about Detroit. It really is a one-industry town. And the technology hasn't changed. Now, if people from Detroit were here, they would be bulging veins and they'd be upset with me. But, I mean, seriously, the car is the same technology for 100 years. It's 4 rubber wheel tires. It's a chassis. It's an internal combustion engine. That hasn't changed, and they're still making them. And it's still the same companies making them. Now, Silicon Valley, by contrast, has this thing going on. And the industries that we invent here will reach a period of maturity, and then they will become extinct in a very short period of time, 5 years or less. I mean, that's what's so amazing, this dynamic churning property. I mean, seriously, daisy wheel printers, dot matrix printers, floppy disk drives, disks themselves. I mean, all of this stuff. Yes, good. A comment, please.
How many of those in 2002 are in that list in 2012?
I would have to update that for you. I'm not sure. That's research. We could do it on Google real quick. But it's something like that. OK? Who else has a question? Somebody else was asking? Nope. OK, good. So the other amazing thing, again, I'm telling you stuff that you already know. A lot of people talk about Silicon Valley, and they talk about it this way, which is it's all of these big blue-chip companies that everybody's heard of. But the real story of Silicon Valley is you guys. It's this. It's small startup companies, and this is a chart that shows you companies in the region with 7 employees or less. And that's the point where we can actually track them because they have to file papers. And what we track is the churn. We're interested in how many are being born and how many are dying. See, because every day in Silicon Valley, a company is born and a company dies. And so what we're interested in is if the rate is net positive. Now, this chart's only through 2002. I'm sorry, we've got new charts. I'll have to update my deck. Last year, our rate was negative. It was actually net negative. We had more companies die than survive last year. This year, that reversed, and it reversed by 4 to 1. So in the year 2012, we had 46,000 companies birthed in Silicon Valley, 46,000. Again, remember, this is off the charts. There's no other region that can say that. And then we had about 12,000 die. And so that was our net. Our net was that. OK, here's a question. Yep.
Percentage of these companies that went out of business or were acquired in acquisition while remaining in Silicon Valley?
No, these are not acquisitions. These are deaths.
So it goes from 82 to 2000 to that.
This chart is different. Yeah, these are also deaths. Yeah, we're saying, yeah, not that they are acquired or something, that they just become defunct. That's what we're saying. OK? So anyway, here's another thing that we always have to help policymakers understand when we're talking about Silicon Valley's issues, is that a place like Silicon Valley, so brutally churning, is always going to be subject to this boom-bust cycle. And it's going to happen with regularity. And this sort of shows you how it works. There's this, a company comes in, then a flood of competitors will come in to take advantage of those opportunities. And then there will always be this period of shaking out. And then the winners will emerge from that, and it'll be a handful of winners. And then there will be a stabilizing. And then, actually, there will be a dip. And we see this about every 10 years. It's pretty regular. Silicon Valley will go bust. And you wait for the next big thing to happen and for the hype cycle to start all over again. That's the Silicon Valley way. It's this destructive, constructive cycle that keeps happening. And people overseas will look at this, and they will consider this terribly inefficient. That this is the worst way to plan an economy. They may be right, because there's all kinds of destruction here, all kinds of casualties, corpses all over the place. And what's fascinating is that every time we hit one of those downturns, when Silicon Valley goes bust and we plunge into a recession, people will write our obituary. They'll write us off. They'll say the magic has gone out of Silicon Valley. And they're very serious. I mean, these aren't people flying off the handle. These are reputable publications. That's Business Week, writing our obituary. This is the Los Angeles Times. Poe Bronson is a very good journalist. And they all sized it up, and they thought Silicon Valley has lost its magic. Well, look, that was Business Week in '85. That was the LA Times in '91. That was Poe Bronson 10 years ago. And yet here we are. So Silicon Valley has this characteristic, and this is something that we're always having to help policy makers understand so that they don't fly off the handle every time there's another downturn. we always have to tell them that downturns are actually good, that it's sort of like forest fires. They even have planned fires because there's times when you want to thin out those forests and make it possible for new growth to come in. So we also point out that this phenomenon goes back a century or more. And these are examples of it: the telegraph, the train, and you could have argued that there was all kinds of redundancy there. They were building too much infrastructure, too much telegraphy, and redundant rail lines and so forth. But what comes out of that is stuff that you can never forecast, and we're always pointing that out. And here's an example: what the telegraph actually did, and the railroads is it gave birth to these other things that nobody anticipated, like the Associated Press and cheap telegraphy and the national stock market and Sears and Roebuck as a platform for retail. So you just never know what's going to happen in the wake of all of these failures. We always tell people that failure is good. Failure is absolutely a good thing. When you see people failing in Silicon Valley, that means the valley is alive and well and thriving. So here's the question that we're asked all the time. That we're constantly asked this. They say, what's the secret? How does Silicon Valley keep doing this? And how can we do it too? And I want you to know that there is no straightforward answer to that question. That is actually a very complicated question. I don't know how to explain it. It's sort of like asking what single factor explains the success of a farmer? It's sort of like that. And by the way, this is a great book because it uses that analogy. It uses the farmer analogy. This book, if you're really interested in this question, the Silicon Valley Edge, is on Stanford University Press. And it argues that there's no one thing or not even a handful of things. It's a whole bunch of stuff that make this ecosystem in Silicon Valley, and it's because of all of that together in one place. That's why it's become this thriving habitat for startups. Back to the farm metaphor, if you're thinking about a farmer, what makes a farmer succeed? Well, it's clear that the farmer needs a lot of things. Needs quality seeds, needs good soil and the soil additives, needs irrigation, the infrastructure for irrigation, needs fertilizers, needs insecticides, needs a distribution system, needs harvesting equipment. I mean, all of these things explain the farmer's success. You can't say that one of those things is the secret. It has to be the whole package, right? And so that's what we're arguing here about Silicon Valley. And I'm just going to throw up a list of these things. We could talk for a long time about all of these, but I just want to highlight a couple. The first one, I think you get this. Silicon Valley is a brutal, results-oriented meritocracy. And the only reason I throw this up on the chart is because I've actually lived other places around the world where this was not the case. I've lived in places where other things matter. Your last name matters, your lineage, your political affiliation, the way you dress, your connections. Those things matter. We always point out that none of that matters in Silicon Valley. What matters is it a good idea? Does it sell? You can be the last person here. You can be just off the boat. It doesn't matter. If you have a good idea, Silicon Valley is a place that you can pursue it. You can have bad manners. You can be slovenly. You can be arrogant. None of that matters. What matters is the quality of the ideas. The second thing we just mentioned, having tolerating failure. This is so crucially important. And so we're always telling policymakers this. Again, I've lived in other places. I lived in Japan, for example. And in Japan, I consider the most extreme example of what I'm talking about. But in Japan, if you fail, that is a badge of shame that you will carry the rest of your life. You cannot escape from it. They even have this phenomenon of, say, a bank president fails, actually commit suicide over that. They will commit suicide over business failures. Now, again, it's extreme examples. But Silicon Valley is the opposite of that extreme, and so we always point that out. Of course, we have these strong markets for venture capital and for labor. I mentioned how highly educated our workforce is. The fluidity of the workforce. There's a lot of places where, and we measure this different ways, but what we've learned is that people change jobs in Silicon Valley all the time. Every couple of years, they will change jobs, and that's okay. You can jump to the competition. That's considered normal. And we think that's, when economists look at that, they think, yeah, that's actually sort of like bees buzzing around and pollinating all of the different flowers and the different bushes and so forth. That's what's happening in Silicon Valley. The fact that we're mobile and fluid is a big deal. Now, favorable government policies. You probably don't sit around thinking about this very much. I'll just point out that this is important. you can take it for granted and that's fine. But this turns out to be very important. And especially when people from overseas come, they start to realize that it makes a difference if there's rule of law in a constitutional framework and protections for private property, including intellectual property, and dispute resolution mechanisms, and a permitting process that works and is actually fair and can, in a process for redressing grievances. All of those things are just crucially important. It also helps to have a government that's thinking about incentives for regulations and investments in R&D and all of those kinds of things. So this is important. The university industry collaboration, hugely important. We measure that. We try to point out how it works. And then the specialized infrastructure that is sprung up here in Silicon Valley is a big part of our, explains a lot of what's going on here. Quality of life we could talk about too. But I think we're going to skip over a bunch of this. I have to check. What time am I supposed to wrap?
You're okay. You've got time still.
Am I okay? Really? I think what I want to do in the time I have remaining is just give you the latest on Silicon Valley as of right now, as of yesterday. I want to tell you some of the key things that are happening in the region in terms of the major indicators that we track. And if any of this is of remote interest to you, I want to make you aware that we have a major event on Friday, if you're around. It's called the State of the Valley Conference. We gather every year. Everybody gets up out of their trenches, comes up out of their foxholes, wherever they are, and we gather in San Jose at Parkside Hall. There's going to be about 1,200 people there, and we spend the day talking about the state of the region, looking at all those indicators, all this kind of stuff, how we're doing on the innovation front, on the startup front, the venture capital front, the government front, all of that. And we release what we call the Silicon Valley Index, and then we do a complete workup. We'll brief you on what's happening across all those indicators, and then we spend the rest of the day talking about it, talking about what it means, what our challenges are, what our priorities should be as a region, and how we can go about addressing those. So just let me give you a couple of the headlines that are going to be coming out of that conference in case you're interested. And then I'll jump off your stage. The big headline is that Silicon Valley is experiencing prodigious growth, just prodigious. That's the best word for it. The raw number of jobs coming out of our region last year, over the last 12 months, was 92,000. We created 92,000 new jobs. So that's the kind of employment growth that we're experiencing. We haven't seen numbers like that since the dot-com thing way back in 2000. And that was a lot of excessive hype and exuberance, and sort of the engine was overheating. The thing about those 92,000 jobs is that they really seem real. They seem measured, guarded, cautious. The venture capital money, as you well know, is hard to get, and yet they're getting it. And the other interesting thing about those jobs is that they're spread farther than they've been spread before. They're not located just in the south part of the Bay, which is typically understood as Silicon Valley. They're located in a horseshoe around the entire Bay. The East Bay is growing. Oakland is growing. Alameda County is experiencing real growth. There's a lot of startup activity over there, more than any of us thought. San Francisco is the big story. San Francisco, I think you know, used to be an old line town. We thought of it as a very traditional place, banking, finance, real estate, but now it's clearly a tech town, especially in social media, internet, so-called Web 2.0, all of that. It is outstripping Silicon Valley, the traditional south part of the Bay, in terms of employment growth and venture capital funding, more of it going there. So this is pretty amazing, and it's a great story. It's great to see. We think it's great for our region. It poses interesting questions from a community standpoint. We have to figure out how we're going to accommodate all of this growth and how we can plan for it, provide the kind of infrastructure that we need. So that's one of the big headlines is growth, major growth. Another big headline, though, is that there are some troubling trends that we should be thinking about in Silicon Valley. One is venture capital. Venture capital actually had a bad year. It was a very bad year. And for the first time, venture capital funding decreased since 2009. So it's just getting harder out there. You probably know that. It's getting a lot harder. There's a higher bar that's being set. There's fewer funds. The venture capital industry is coming under a lot of criticism. This is interesting. The Kauffman Foundation just released a major report that shows that venture capital as an industry has not made money for more than 10 years. And that's as an industry. There's, of course, exceptions. But the study shows that they would have made more money had they invested in the stock market or in the S&P 500. So a lot of these funds are now under the microscope. People are becoming very critical, especially the big funds, 500 million and more. And it's hard to figure out what's going on there. Venture capital is also flooding out of some key areas that used to be viewed as a major part of our strategy. Clean technology is one of them. Clean tech. It used to be the darling. Everybody was very excited. You could say exuberant. The money is fleeing out of that sector. So that's pretty significant. We're trying to figure out what that might mean. On the other hand, our reports documenting that angel funding has had dramatic increases. In fact, a 90% growth in angel funding in Silicon Valley. When you add in San Francisco's numbers, also extremely impressive. And angel funding is hard to measure. You can't even measure all of it. But what we can measure is showing phenomenal growth. So there's something happening there. We're also troubled in the same report to report that federal funding is no longer coming into Silicon Valley in the way that it has historically. We're seeing those numbers drop off. In fact, believe it or not, federal funding going into R&D and contracts and procurement is fallen below the national average. We're now behind places like Alabama, Huntsville, Alabama. And that's a different story for Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley was really built on federal funding. And so this is something that we're going to be looking at very carefully in the years to come. Well, there's other interesting indicators in there we could talk about. Immigration is actually happening less in Silicon Valley. There are fewer people coming here than have historically. Fewer people are getting degrees from our colleges and research institutions, graduate schools. A lot of people think that's a very troubling sign. That's why we're very concerned about the legislation that's being debated right now in Washington, and if we're going to take a comprehensive approach to immigration reform. So those are some of the things that we have coming out of this upcoming index that we're going to release on Friday. Well, maybe I can just call it right there. I could talk all day long, but those are the big things, some of the big picture items. And let me just wrap by telling you that I'm happy to answer your questions, and I feel privileged to be talking to a group like this because you guys are the ones. You're the ones that have the magic. Thanks. Here's a question.
I saw a contradiction you said about built on federal funding, but it was an accident.
Okay, so let me elaborate. When I say it's an accident, what I mean is that it just happened. It wasn't planned. It was not a planned phenomenon. There isn't anybody that sat down and in a technocratic way said, let's build an industrial park and make sure it has all of these features. Silicon Valley grew up organically, and nobody forecasted. That's what I mean. Now, the second thing that I want to point out is that there is this mythology that Silicon Valley is something that happened in people's garages. And that's a great mythology. We love it. I mean, we love these stories. Steve Jobs really did build Apple in a garage at the start, and so did Hewlett and Packard. And Jerry Yang, my Stanford classmate, started Yahoo in his dorm room at Stanford. He actually invited me to be a part of it. I could have had in on that action. And I said, I don't know, Jerry, what are you calling it? Yippee? You calling it Yippee? And he said, no, Yahoo. And I said, that's crazy. I don't want to, I can't imagine getting involved. One of the dumbest decisions I made. But what's my point? So people think that's how Silicon Valley happens, is in people's garages, people tinkering around, being entrepreneurial, when in fact, most of our economic growth, development happened because there was massive amounts of federal funding coming into companies, Intel and National Semiconductor and HP and all the rest.